The email notification chimed on my laptop, pulling me away from the spreadsheets I'd been analyzing for hours. I rubbed my tired eyes and glanced at the screen, where an unfamiliar real estate agency's name appeared in bold. The subject line made my heart stop. Congratulations on the sale of your property at 47 Maple Avenue. Frank. I should have known. My hands trembled as I opened the message, scanning the professionally worded congratulations about the successful closing of our family home, a closing I knew nothing about. The attached documents showed the final sale price, the commission fees, and the transfer of funds to an account I didn't recognize. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My home of 12 years, sold without my knowledge or consent. The room seemed to spin around me as the reality sank in. My name is Abigail, and for the past 15 years, Frank has been systematically dismantling my sense of security. When we first met at a corporate retreat, he was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in building a life together. Within a year, we were married, and I believed I'd found my forever partner. But beneath his confident smile and impressive credentials was a man who viewed our relationship as a game of chess, always calculating his next move, always 3 steps ahead, and always putting his desires above everything else. The house on Maple Avenue wasn't just a piece of property. It was the place where I'd planted a garden that bloomed reliably each spring, where I'd meticulously renovated the vintage kitchen to include the farmhouse sink I'd always dreamed of. It was where I'd converted the small 3rd bedroom into a home office, the place where I'd finally started building my consulting business after years of Frank telling me it was just a hobby. I stared at the email, shock giving way to a familiar anger. How could he possibly think he had the right to sell our home? How could he make this life-altering decision without even a conversation? The familiar sounds of my neighborhood drifted through the open window. Children playing, the neighbor's dog barking, the distant hum of lawnmowers. All of it would soon be memories. I scrolled through the email again, looking for details that might explain this betrayal. There, in the closing paragraph, was a note about relocation for exciting new opportunities and a timeline for vacating the property within 30 days. 30 days to leave the home I'd poured my heart into. Breathe, I whispered to myself, trying to calm the storm inside me. I picked up my phone and dialed Frank's number. It went straight to voicemail. Of course it did. Frank, I just received an email about the sale of our house, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. Call me back immediately. This isn't legal, and you know it. I ended the call and stared out the window at the Japanese maple tree I'd planted 5 years ago, now reaching toward the 2nd-story windows with delicate red leaves. Another call, this time to Jessica, my oldest friend who had never trusted Frank from the beginning. He did what? Jessica's voice rose in disbelief when I explained the situation. Abby, he can't just sell your house without your signature. There's no way that's legal. That's what I thought, I said, moving to my desk and opening my laptop. But he's done it somehow. The closing already happened. Check your documents, Jessica said firmly. There's no way he could do this without forgery or some other trick, and if he did, that's criminal. As I hung up, a strange calm washed over me. Frank thought he'd outmaneuvered me, that I would collapse into helplessness as I had so many times before when he'd made unilateral decisions about our life together. But this time was different. This time, I had something he didn't know about. What? Frank didn't realize, what I'd carefully kept from him for the past 3 years, was that I'd been preparing for this moment. Not this exact scenario, perhaps, but I'd known that someday he would go too far. The separate bank account I'd opened at a different bank, the consultation with a divorce attorney for a friend, the careful documentation of our assets in a password-protected file, all of it had been leading to this moment. Most importantly, there was the matter of ownership. When we'd purchased the house, my parents had gifted us part of the down payment with one condition: that my name be listed first on the deed, with a special provision that required both signatures for any sale. Frank had grudgingly agreed, seeing it as an inconsequential detail at the time. He'd forgotten about it, or perhaps he thought I had. I pulled open my filing cabinet and retrieved the folder labeled Home Documents. There it was, in black and white, the provision that made any sale without my signature invalid. I sat down at my kitchen table, and began to plan my next move. The revelation should have left me crushed, but instead I felt something unexpected: strength. For years, Frank had chipped away at my confidence, questioned my decisions, and dismissed my concerns. But sitting there, faced with this ultimate betrayal, I realized I was no longer the uncertain woman who second-guessed herself. I opened a new document on my laptop and began typing, methodically listing what I knew, what I needed to find out, and who could help me fight back. I called the real estate agency listed in the email, but it was already after hours. Tomorrow, then. Tomorrow, I would begin unraveling this mess. As dusk settled over the neighborhood, I walked through each room of the house, touching the walls, the furniture, the small details that made this place mine. I wouldn't let it go without a fight. Frank had underestimated me for the last time. The truth was, I'd been invisible to Frank for years, my needs secondary, my opinions dismissed, my presence a convenience rather than a priority. He'd come to see me as a background character in his life, someone who would adapt to his whims without resistance. This time would be different. This time, the invisible would become invincible. I met Frank 12 years ago at a fundraising gala for the children's hospital where I volunteered. He was handsome in his tailored suit, with perfect teeth and the kind of confidence that filled a room. I was 32 then, working as a financial analyst and finally feeling like I was finding my footing after years of struggling to advance in a male-dominated industry. Frank noticed me across the room and made his way over, champagne, flute in hand. "You look like the only person here who isn't pretending to enjoy themselves," he said with a grin that reached his eyes. I laughed, surprised by his honesty, and something sparked between us. He was successful, charismatic, and seemed genuinely interested in my work and passions. Within 6 months, we were engaged. Within a year, we were married in a lavish ceremony that, looking back, was more about impressing his business associates than celebrating our love. The first 2 years were good, or at least I thought they were. Frank had a high-powered job at an investment firm, and I continued my work in finance. We complemented each other, or so I believed. When my father passed away suddenly, Frank was there, holding my hand at the funeral, helping me sort through the inheritance, which included a substantial sum that would eventually become the down payment for our house on Maple Avenue. The cracks started to show during the house hunting process. Frank wanted a showpiece in the most prestigious neighborhood, something that screamed success. I wanted a home, someplace with character, with potential, with a garden. We compromised on the charming colonial on Maple Avenue, though compromise with Frank usually meant surrendering after weeks of subtle pressure and passive-aggressive comments. My mother, always perceptive, pulled me aside during one of her visits shortly after we moved in. We were in the kitchen, preparing dinner while Frank was in his study on a business call. "Abigail," she said softly, "are you happy?" The question caught me off guard. "Of course, Mom. Why wouldn't I be? We have this beautiful house. Our careers are going well." She placed her hand over mine. "That's not what I asked, sweetheart." Something in her eyes made my throat tighten. "We're just adjusting," I said. "Frank works hard, and he has high standards." Mom nodded slowly. "When your father and I gave you that money, we added that provision to the deed for a reason. Marriage is a partnership, but it's important to protect yourself." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. At the time, I'd brushed off her concern. Frank had been annoyed about the provision requiring dual signatures for any sale of the property, but he'd signed the paperwork without too much fuss. I thought my mother was being overprotective, a remnant of her generation's approach to marriage. Didn't see then how Frank's behavior was shifting, so gradually that I hardly noticed. The way he began questioning my spending, insisting we use a joint account he primarily controlled. The way he'd dismiss my ideas at dinner parties, talking over me or correcting me with a laugh and a, "What my wife means is," the way he began to isolate me from friends who weren't good for us. Friends like Jessica, who saw through his charm. When I suggested using my financial expertise to start a consulting business 3 years ago, he laughed and called it cute that I wanted a little side project. But I pursued it anyway, working early mornings and late nights, building a client base slowly but surely. I opened a separate business account, the one Frank didn't know about, and started saving what I earned instead of depositing it into our joint account. It was around that time that things began to unravel more quickly. Frank's firm was under pressure, and he was passed over for a promotion he'd been certain he would get. He became more controlling at home, more critical of my choices, more insistent that his way was the only way. When he suggested I give up my hobby business to support his career more actively, I finally recognized the pattern my mother had tried to warn me about years earlier. Last year, Frank began traveling more frequently for work. The trips were always urgent, always essential for his career advancement. I noticed changes when he returned, a new restlessness, a distance between us that hadn't been there before. Our conversations became transactional, focused on household logistics rather than connection. When I tried to discuss the growing rift between us, he deflected, blamed work stress, or turned it around to criticize my negativity. 2 months ago, he mentioned a potential job opportunity that would require relocation. I expressed my reluctance to leave. My business was finally gaining traction, I loved our home, and I had built a community here. Frank seemed to accept my perspective, or so I thought. The subject didn't come up again. Now, staring at the email confirming the sale of our home, the pieces clicked into place. The frequent trips, the evasiveness about his recent activities, the mail he'd insisted on collecting each day before I could see it. He hadn't been planning with me, he'd been planning around me. As night fell on what might be one of my last evenings in my home, I sat in my garden, watching fireflies blink among my carefully tended flowers. The weight of Frank's betrayal pressed on my chest, making it hard to breathe. This wasn't just about a house, it was about years of having my autonomy steadily eroded, of being treated as an accessory to Frank's life rather than a partner in. And I thought about the girl I was when I met Frank, ambitious, confident, full of plans for the future. Somewhere along the way, I'd started to lose her, to doubt her instincts, to quiet her voice. The consulting business had been my first step toward reclaiming that self. Now, this crisis would be the next. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "Whatever you need, I'm here. We'll fight this together." I took a deep breath of the night air, filled with the scent of the roses I'd planted and nurtured. Frank might have sold the house out from under me, but he had no idea what I was capable of. It was time he found out. The morning after discovering Frank's betrayal, I woke before sunrise. For a moment, in the hazy space between sleep and wakefulness, everything was normal. Then reality crashed back. My home had been sold out from under. Me and I had 30 days to leave. I got up and walked through the quiet house, running my fingers along the walls as if to memorize their texture. Every corner of this place held a piece of me, far beyond the material value Frank had so callously converted to cash. The kitchen was where I'd found my passion for cooking again. After years of rushed takeout meals to accommodate Frank's unpredictable schedule, I'd reclaimed this space, experimenting with recipes my grandmother had passed down to me. The antique hutch in the corner, a A flea market find I'd carefully restored, now displayed her china, which Frank had once suggested we sell because it didn't match our aesthetic. I made coffee and carried it to the sunroom at the back of the house. This was my sanctuary, a space Frank rarely entered. The morning light filtered through stained glass panels I'd installed myself, casting rainbow patterns across the floorboards. I'd learned how to do the installation from Anna, my neighbor 2 houses down, during a period when Frank was away on one of his extended business trips. She'd taught me other things too: how to use power tools, how to fix a leaking faucet, how to feel capable in ways Frank had subtly convinced me I wasn't. This house wasn't just walls and a roof. It was the physical manifestation of my gradual awakening, my slow reclamation of independence. I settled into the wicker chair, cradling my coffee mug, and let myself remember how we found this place. It was the 7th house we'd viewed that day, and I'd been ready to give up. Frank was irritable, dismissive of everything the realtor had shown us. But then we turned onto Maple Avenue, and I saw it, the slightly weathered colonial with black shutters and a wraparound porch, set back from the street behind a massive oak tree. "That one," I said, pointing. "Can we see that one?" Frank had frowned. "It looks old, probably needs a ton of work." But something pulled me toward it, and for once, I insisted. The moment I stepped inside, I knew. The house needed love. Outdated. Wallpaper. Worn carpets hiding what I suspected were original hardwood floors. A kitchen straight out of the 1970s. But beneath the cosmetic issues was solid bones and endless potential. "We can make it ours," I told Frank, squeezing his hand as we stood in what would become our living room. "We can build something here." In a rare moment of alignment, he saw it too, or at least enough of it to agree. My father's inheritance covered most of the down payment, and we became homeowners. My mother's insistence on the dual signature provision seemed excessive then, a relic of her generation's distrust. "Marriage is forever," I'd told her. "But protection is wise," she'd replied, her eyes knowing in a way I couldn't understand until now. Over the years, as Frank's career demands grew, this house became increasingly my domain. I researched renovation techniques, learned to use tools, formed friendships with neighbors who shared their skills. While Frank networked and climbed corporate ladders, I created a home, not just for us, but for the community we'd built. The annual Memorial Day barbecue in our backyard, the book club that met in our living room once a month, the holiday cookie exchange that had started with 3 neighbors and grown to include nearly the whole street. What hurt most about Frank's betrayal wasn't just the loss of the physical structure, but the centrality it held in the life I'd built largely without him. He had sold my creation, my achievement, my refuge, as if it were merely an asset on a balance sheet. I moved from the sunroom to my home office, the smallest bedroom that Frank had initially designated as storage. When I started my consulting business, I'd cleared it out, painted the walls a soft blue-gray, and furnished it with pieces that made me feel professional and focused. My business had grown steadily from this room, client by client, project by project, each success building my confidence that Frank had worked so hard to diminish. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Frank saw my business as a cute hobby, it had provided me with the separate bank account he knew nothing about, the account that might now become my lifeline. What had started as a small act of self-preservation had grown into something more: financial independence that Frank couldn't touch or control. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop, checking the email from the real estate agency again. The sale. Price made me gasp anew, 15% below market value, a rushed transaction that suggested Frank's desperation. What could be so urgent that he would sacrifice thousands of dollars on a quick sale? And where was that money now? A knock at the front door interrupted my thoughts. Through the window, I saw Jessica's car in the driveway. I opened the door to find her holding a tray with 2 coffee cups and a paper bag that smelled of cinnamon. I figured you could use backup, she said, stepping inside. And pastries. Definitely pastries. Jessica had been my friend since college, long before Frank. She'd been skeptical of him from the beginning, sensing something beneath his charm that I'd been too enchanted to see. Over the years, as Frank had subtly discouraged our friendship, we'd found ways to stay connected, often meeting for coffee when he traveled. He's really done it this time, I said, leading her to the kitchen. Sold our home without even telling me. Jessica set down the coffee and pastries, then wrapped me in a hug. This house is special, she said. Not just because it's beautiful, but because of what you've made it. Exactly, I whispered, fighting back tears. It's not just losing a house, it's losing part of myself. As we sat at the kitchen island with our coffee, I looked around at the space I'd lovingly created. The hand-painted tiles above the sink, the herb garden thriving on the windowsill, the collection of cookbooks inherited from my grandmother. Each element represented hours of care, thought, and personal history. You know what makes me angriest? I said. He never even saw it. All these years he's lived here without seeing what this place really is, what it means. To him, it was just an asset to liquidate when he needed cash. Jessica reached across the counter and squeezed my hand. Then it's time to show him exactly what he's underestimated. Looking into my oldest friend's determined eyes, I felt something shift inside me. Grief giving way to resolve. This house held my past, but it wouldn't define my future. Frank had taken enough from me already. He wouldn't take anything more. The real estate office of Morrison & Associates occupied the ground floor of a sleek downtown building, all glass and polished surfaces designed to convey success and trustworthiness. I straightened my blazer before pushing through the door, feeling a strange mix of dread and determination. Jessica had offered to come with me, but this was something I needed to do alone. I'm here to see Noelle Morrison, I told the receptionist, keeping my voice steady. My name is Abigail Winters. It's regarding the sale of 47 Maple Avenue. The receptionist's smile faltered slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. Of course. Do you have an appointment? No, but I'm sure she'll want to speak with me, I said, infusing my voice with the confidence I'd once had in abundance, before years with Frank had eroded it. I'm the co-owner of the property that was just sold. 5 minutes later, I was seated across from Noelle Morrison, a polished woman in her 50s with shrewd eyes and a cautious expression. Mrs. Winters, she began, I understand you have questions about your property. I assure you, all the paperwork was properly processed. Your husband handled the transaction with complete transparency. I placed my leather portfolio on her desk and opened it deliberately. I'm sure everything seemed transparent from your perspective, Ms. Morrison. However, there's a significant problem. I slid the certified copy of our property deed across her desk. If you look at this document, you'll notice a specific provision. The house cannot be sold without both owners' signatures. My signature is conspicuously absent from your paperwork. The color drained from Noelle's face as she examined the document. This wasn't in the title search. I imagine my husband found a way around that, I said calmly. Perhaps by providing documentation that I was unavailable, or through some other means. Either way, the sale is invalid. Noelle's professional demeanor cracked slightly. Mrs. Winters, the sale has already closed. The funds have been transferred. The new owners are expecting to take possession in 30 days. That's unfortunate for everyone involved, I replied, maintaining eye contact. But it doesn't change the legal reality. I never consented to this sale, and I never signed any documents. Whatever signature you have purporting to be mine is fraudulent. She tapped her manicured nails against the desk, visibly recalculating. I'll need to consult with our legal team. If what you're saying is accurate, we have a serious situation. Indeed we do, I agreed. I'll need copies of all documents related to the sale, particularly anything with my supposed signature on it. After a tense half-hour discussion, I left the office with a folder containing copies of everything I'd requested. Walking to my car, I called Jessica. They didn't even question the signatures, I told her, my hands shaking with a mix of anger and vindication. Frank must have forged my name on multiple documents. That's not just unethical, Abby. That's criminal, Jessica said. What are you going to do now? What Frank didn't know, what I hadn't shared with anyone except Jessica and my attorney, was that I had more than just the deed provision protecting me. 3 years ago, when I began to recognize the subtle patterns of control in our marriage, I had opened not only a separate business account, but a personal one as well. Each month, I'd transferred small amounts from my earnings, building a safety, net one deposit at a time. I'd also maintained meticulous records of our finances, tracking every unusual withdrawal Frank made, every questionable expense, every instance where money disappeared without explanation. It had started as a way to make sense of our financial situation when Frank became increasingly evasive, but it had evolved into something more. Evidence. I'm going to meet with Arnold, I replied, referring to the attorney I'd consulted 18 months earlier when I first suspected something wasn't right in our marriage. I'd told Frank I was having lunch with a client, but instead had spent 2 hours discussing what would be involved in protecting myself financially if I ever needed to leave. At the time, I wasn't ready to take that step. Now, I had no choice. Arnold's office was in an old converted Victorian house, far less imposing than the sleek real estate agency, but somehow more substantial. He greeted me with the same calm attentiveness I remembered from our previous meeting. I wish we were meeting again under better circumstances, he said, gesturing for me to sit. Jessica mentioned you're dealing with a property issue. I laid out the situation, showing him the sale documents with what was clearly a forgery of my signature. Arnold studied them carefully, his expression growing increasingly grave. This is serious, Abigail. Your husband has committed fraud, possibly multiple counts. The good news is that the provision in your deed is ironclad. The sale cannot legally proceed without your authentic signature. What about the money? I asked. The funds have already been transferred to an account I don't have access to. Arnold leaned back in his chair. That's where things get complicated. We'll need to act quickly to freeze those assets before they disappear completely. Do you have any idea what Frank might be planning to do with the money? I shook my head, then remembered something. The job opportunity he mentioned 2 months ago, he said it would require relocation. I said I didn't want to move, and he seemed to drop it. But maybe he didn't. That could explain the rushed sale and below market price. Arnold nodded. He needed cash quickly for whatever he's planning next. As Arnold outlined our legal strategy, I felt a strange sense of clarity emerging from the chaos. Years of small indignities and subtle control had culminated in this enormous betrayal, but in a way, Frank had done me a favor. He'd finally shown his true self so unmistakably that I could no longer make excuses or minimize his behavior. There's something else you should know, I said, opening my portfolio again and removing a separate folder. I've been keeping detailed records of our finances for the past 3 years. Every unusual transaction, every unexplained expense. I handed him the folder. And I have a separate account he doesn't know about. Arnold's eyebrows raised as he flipped through my meticulous documentation. This is remarkably thorough. Most people in your situation don't have anything close to this level of record keeping. Finance is my profession, I said with a small smile. And when things started feeling wrong in our marriage, tracking the money helped me feel like I had some control. What I didn't say was how many nights I'd stayed up after Frank went to bed, reconciling accounts, noting patterns, building a paper trail while telling myself I was being paranoid. How I'd created spreadsheets that tracked the gradual drainage of our joint savings. How I'd documented the way Frank had increasingly restricted my access to our finances while expanding his own spending. Well, your foresight may have saved you, Arnold said, closing the folder. With these records and the separate account, you're in a much stronger position than most clients facing similar situations. As I drove home from Arnold's office, I thought about Frank's confidence in selling our house. He'd assumed I would discover the sale only after it was too late, that I would have no recourse but to accept his decision and follow whatever plan he'd made without my input. He'd underestimated me, as he had for years. The separate account, the financial documentation, the consultation with an attorney, all of it had been my silent resistance, my refusal to be completely erased from my own life. What had started as self-preservation had become my leverage. Frank still hadn't returned my calls or messages. Wherever he was, whatever he was planning, he clearly intended to present me with a fait accompli. Our house sold, our future decided, my role merely to comply with his vision. He had no idea what was coming. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sky had darkened with approaching rain clouds that matched my mood. I needed to act quickly before Frank could do any more damage, but I also needed allies, people who could help me navigate the emotional and practical challenges ahead. I called Sheila first. We'd been neighbors for 9 years, and she had become one of my closest friends despite Frank's dismissive attitude toward what he called my suburban mom friendships. Sheila was anything but a stereotype. A retired criminal prosecutor with a sharp mind and an even sharper tongue, she now taught law part-time at the local university. "I've been trying to tell you he was trouble for years," she said when I explained what had happened. "But this crosses every line. Forgery, fraud, attempted theft. He's not just being a bad husband, he's breaking multiple laws." "That's what Arnold said," I replied, grateful for her straightforward assessment. "But what I need now is a strategy to protect myself while we sort this out legally. Frank still hasn't responded to my calls, and I'm worried about what he might do next." "First things first," Sheila said decisively. "Change the locks today. I know a locksmith who can come this afternoon. Whatever the legal status of the house sale, you're still an owner in residence and you have the right to secure your property." "Can I really do that?" "Absolutely. And frankly, it should have been done years ago." There was no judgment in her voice, just practical concern. "Second, secure your important documents. Birth certificate, passport, financial records, anything Frank might try to use or that you might need if things escalate." After arranging for the locksmith, I called Anna, who had taught me home repair skills and had become a confidant over years of coffee mornings while our children played together. Her husband had left her 3 years earlier in a similarly abrupt fashion, though without the property fraud. "I'll be right over," she said without hesitation, "and I'm bringing reinforcements." Within an hour, my kitchen had become command central. Sheila sat at the island with her laptop, reviewing the legal documents Arnold had helped me prepare. Anna was helping me inventory valuables and personal items that needed to be secured, while Jessica organized a schedule to ensure someone would be with me at all times for the next few days. "I don't need babysitting," I protested weakly, though the thought of facing Frank alone when he eventually returned made my stomach twist. "It's not babysitting, it's witnessing," Jessica corrected me. "Everything he says, everything he does, we want it documented. No more gaslighting, no more, 'That's not what happened.'" As the locksmith worked on the front door, I took a moment alone in my home office. The gravity of what was happening settled over me. I wasn't just protecting my property rights, I was dismantling my marriage, confronting years of manipulation, and stepping into an uncertain future. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Abby, it's Frank. Lost my phone. We need to talk about the house situation. Meet me at Carlton's at 7 tonight." Carlton's was an upscale restaurant where Frank often entertained clients, public enough to discourage a scene, private enough for difficult conversations. The impersonal tone of the message, the convenient lost phone excuse, the attempt to control the where and when of our confrontation, it was all so typically Frank. I showed the message to Sheila, who scoffed. Classic. He wants to get you alone, in a place where you'll feel pressure to maintain appearances. Don't go. I have to face him eventually, I said. Yes, but on your terms, not his. And certainly not without preparation. She looked at me with the same firm expression she probably used with reluctant witnesses. This isn't just about the house anymore, Abigail. This is about recognizing that the man you married has committed serious crimes against you, and he will try everything to maintain control of this situation. Jessica joined us, immediately reading the tension. What happened? I showed her the text. Her eyes narrowed as she read it. He's unbelievable. After everything he's done, he thinks he can just summon you to dinner? The three women exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Then Anna spoke up from the doorway. We'll go with you. What? Not to the table, she clarified. But we'll be at Carlton's, at different tables, watching. You shouldn't face him alone, but you're right that you need to confront him directly. A united front? Jessica added, squeezing my shoulder. He's used to isolating you, making you feel like it's just your word against his. Not this time. I looked around at these women who had materialized in my moment of crisis. Women whose friendship Frank had subtly discouraged over the years, whose importance in my life he had minimized. Now they formed a protective circle around me, offering not just emotional support, but practical assistance, legal advice, and strategic thinking. I hadn't realized how isolated I'd become until I felt the contrast of being truly supported. Frank had methodically separated me from my support system over the years, not through outright prohibition, but through subtle tactics. He'd create conflicts on days when I had plans with friends. He'd make dismissive comments about my little friendships. He'd imply that professional women like me shouldn't waste time on what he called coffee clatches and gossip sessions. And I, eager to be the perfect wife, the sophisticated partner to his ambition, had gradually pulled away from the very people who were now rallying around me. I'll respond to his text, I decided. I'll meet him, but I'm going to be prepared. With Sheila's guidance, I drafted a brief, neutral response accepting the meeting. Then we spent the next 2 hours preparing, reviewing the legal documentation, practicing responses to likely manipulation tactics, and creating a signal I could use if I needed them to intervene. By the time evening approached, the locks had been changed, my most important documents and valuables secured, and an emergency plan established. I stood in my bedroom trying to decide what to wear for this strangest of dinners, when Anna appeared in the doorway. "Wear the blue dress," she said, pointing to a sapphire sheath I'd bought for a rare date night last year. The one he complimented. "It'll throw him off balance." I smiled despite myself. "Are we really strategizing my outfit?" "Everything is strategy now," she replied without apology. "He's had years to perfect his manipulation. You're just catching up." As I dressed, I thought about the account Frank didn't know about. The financial cushion I'd built one client at a time through my hobby business. It wasn't just money. It was possibility. It was proof that part of me had always known this. Day might come that some deep instinct had pushed me to prepare even as I hoped I was wrong. I applied my makeup with unusual care, strengthening myself for the confrontation ahead. The face that looked back at me from the mirror seemed different somehow, more defined, less willing to soften its edges to accommodate someone else's comfort. "Ready?" Jessica asked, appearing behind me. "As I'll ever be," I replied, picking up my purse. We drove to Carlton's in separate cars. Me alone, the others staggered to avoid attracting attention. As I handed my keys to the valet, I took a deep breath of the evening air, scented with the restaurant's signature herb garden. Inside, I spotted Frank immediately, sitting at our table by the window, studying the wine list with the absorbed concentration he always affected in upscale settings. For a moment, seeing him in his familiar posture, slightly hunched shoulders, head tilted, made my heart stutter with the force of old habits. This was my husband of 12 years, the man who had once made me laugh until my sides hurt, who had held my hand through my father's funeral, who had chosen the paint color for our living room with meticulous care. But he was also the man who had sold our home without my knowledge, forged my signature, and planned to disappear with the proceeds. I straightened my shoulders and walked toward the table, feeling the invisible strength of my friends positioned strategically around the restaurant. Frank looked up as I approached, his practiced smile faltering slightly at whatever he saw in my face. "Abby," he said, rising halfway from his seat. "You look lovely." I sat down across from him, placing my purse deliberately on the table between us. "Let's skip the pleasantries, Frank. Tell me why you forged my signature and sold our house." Frank's practiced smile froze, then slowly dissolved into something more calculating. He glanced around the restaurant, clearly assessing who might be within earshot before leaning forward. "Lower your voice," he said, his tone pleasant but eyes sharp. "There's no need to create a scene." "I'm not creating a scene," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "I'm asking a direct question about a direct action you took. You sold our house without my knowledge or consent. You forged my signature on legal documents. I want to know why." He sighed dramatically, as if I were being unreasonable. "Abby, you're overreacting. Yes, I handled the sale without bothering you with all the details, but it was for our benefit. A fantastic opportunity came up. The timing was critical." "What opportunity?" I asked, not touching the glass of water the server had placed before. My firm is opening an office in Seattle. They've offered me the position of regional director, a significant promotion, substantially higher salary, stock options." His eyes lit up with genuine excitement. "It's everything we've been working toward." "Everything you've been working toward," I corrected him. "I never said I wanted to move to Seattle. I never said I wanted to leave my business, my community, my home." Frank waved his hand dismissively. "Your little consulting thing can be done from anywhere. And we'll buy a better house in Seattle, modern, with views. You'll love it once you see it." I studied him across the table, suddenly seeing with perfect clarity the patterns that had defined our marriage. Frank decided, Frank acted, and I was expected to adapt, to be grateful for being included in his vision at all. My input wasn't sought because my approval was assumed. Or rather, my approval wasn't considered necessary. "The house on Maple Avenue wasn't yours to sell," I said quietly. "Not legally, not morally." "Don't be dramatic," he replied, picking up the wine list again as if the matter were settled. "The money from the sale is already earmarked for our new place. I've got a real estate agent in Seattle sending listings. Top school district close to my new office. Frank." I placed my hand on the wine list, forcing him to look at me. "I spoke with the real estate agency today. I showed them our deed with the provision requiring both our signatures for any sale. I've consulted an attorney. The sale is invalid." The color drained from his face, replaced quickly by a flush of anger. "You what?" "The sale cannot proceed legally. The funds will need to be returned to the buyers." I kept my voice measured, aware of the other diners around us. "Furthermore, the forgery of my signature is a criminal offense." Frank's expression cycled rapidly through shock, anger, and then, most tellingly, calculation. He reached across the table for my hand, his face softening into the concerned, loving husband I had once believed in completely. "Abby, sweetheart, I know this has been a shock, and I apologize for not discussing it with you first. That was thoughtless of me." His voice dropped to the intimate tone he used when he wanted something. "But this move is crucial for our future. For our family. We've always talked about advancement, about building something meaningful together. 5 years ago, even 2 years ago, this approach would have worked. I would have melted under his attention, questioned my own reactions, convinced myself that his intentions were good even if his methods were flawed. But now, I felt nothing but a cold clarity. Where is the money, Frank? His hand withdrew slightly. What? The proceeds from the sale. Where are they? In our investment account, of course. For the new house. He frowned, as if offended by the question. Which investment account? I checked all our joint accounts this afternoon. No large deposits. Frank's jaw tightened. It's in a temporary holding account until the Seattle move is finalized. Honestly, Abby, this suspicious attitude isn't like you. I almost laughed at the absurdity. The man who had forged my signature and sold our house without telling me was accusing me of being unreasonably suspicious. I want the money returned to the buyers, Frank. I want the sale canceled. And I want you to explain to me exactly what you thought would happen when I discovered what you'd done. I thought you'd be reasonable, he snapped, his mask of contrition slipping. I thought you'd understand that this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that benefits both of us. Instead, you're acting like I've committed some terrible crime. You have, I said simply. Forgery is a felony in this state. Frank's eyes darted around the restaurant again, clearly concerned about who might overhear. When he spoke again, his voice was low and intense. Listen to me very carefully. If you pursue this legally, if you try to undo the sale, you'll be destroying not just my career but our entire future. Is that what you want? To throw away 12 years of marriage over one decision you don't like? I felt something shift inside. Me, a final piece clicking into place. This wasn't just about the house or the move or even the forgery. It was about the fundamental question that had been growing in my mind for years. Did I matter in this marriage as an equal partner? Or was I simply expected to orbit Frank's decisions, conforming my life to his desires? It's not one decision, Frank, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. It's a pattern. You've been making unilateral decisions about our life together for years, each one eroding my agency a little more. The house is just the most egregious example. That's ridiculous, he scoffed. You've always had complete freedom. I've supported your little business, haven't I? I've never stopped you from doing anything you wanted. As long as what I wanted didn't interfere with your plans, I pointed out. As long as my desires were small enough to fit into the margins of your ambitions. Frank leaned back, studying me with narrowed eyes. You've changed, he said, as if noticing me for the first time. Who's been filling your head with this feminist victim nonsense? Jessica, I bet. I almost smiled at his predictable deflection. No one needed to fill my head with anything. I've been watching and feeling and experiencing this relationship for 12 years. I just finally decided to trust my own perceptions. Our server approached with a practiced smile. Are you ready to order? We need a few more minutes, Frank answered without looking at me. When we were alone again, he leaned forward, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. Abby, I admit I handled this poorly. I should have discussed the move with you before finalizing the house sale. But what's done is done. Fighting this will only make things messy in public. Think about how that will look for both of us. I considered his words, turning them over carefully in my mind. He was offering a non-apology, acknowledging a tactical error rather than a moral failing, while simultaneously threatening me with public embarrassment if I didn't fall in line. It was manipulation cloaked as reconciliation, and I suddenly felt exhausted by the familiar pattern. At that moment, I had a startling realization. I didn't love Frank anymore. Perhaps I hadn't for a long time. What I had loved was the idea of our marriage, the narrative I'd constructed to explain away his behavior, the future I kept believing we were working toward together. But the man sitting across from me, calculating how to manage my reaction to his betrayal, was a stranger I had no desire to follow to Seattle or anywhere else. I want a divorce, I said, the words emerging with a certainty that surprised even me. Frank's expression froze, then darkened. Don't be hasty. You're upset, I understand, but I'm not upset, Frank. I'm clear. Perhaps for the first time in years. I picked up my purse, preparing to stand. My attorney will contact you about reversing the house sale and beginning divorce proceedings. His hand shot out, gripping my wrist. With unexpected force. You are not walking away from me, he hissed, all pretense of civility evaporating. Not after everything I've invested in this marriage, in you. You think you can manage without me? You think your little business will support you? You're nothing without me, Abby. I looked pointedly at his hand on my wrist, then back at his face. Let go of me, Frank. From the corner of my eye, I saw Jessica rise from her table across the restaurant, Sheila and Anna tensing in their seats, ready to intervene. But I needed to finish this myself. You've crossed too many lines, I said calmly. The house was just the final one. Let go of my wrist, or I'll call the police and report both the forgery and assault right now. Something in my voice must have convinced him I was serious. His fingers slowly uncurled, leaving red marks on my skin. This isn't over, he warned. No, I agreed, standing up. It's just beginning. As I walked away from the table, from Frank, from the marriage I had invested 12 years in, I felt strangely light. The decision I had been unconsciously approaching for years had finally been made. Not in a moment of emotional crisis, but in a moment of absolute clarity. Outside in the cool evening air, I took a deep, steadying breath. Jessica appeared at my side, followed quickly by Sheila and Anna. You okay? Jessica asked, her eyes concerned. No, I admitted. But I will be. The morning after my restaurant confrontation with Frank, I woke to a flurry of text messages from him. They ranged from angry, "You're making a huge mistake," to pleading, "Please, let's talk about this rationally," to manipulative, "Think about how this will affect everyone who cares about us." I read each one dispassionately, seeing them for what they were, desperate attempts to regain control. I was sitting at my kitchen island, reviewing the cease and desist letter Arnold had prepared regarding the house sale, when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw Frank standing on the porch, his posture stiff with tension. I took a deep breath, grateful for the new locks and the security chain, and opened the door a few inches. What do you want, Frank? His eyes widened at the chain across the door. You changed the locks? On our house? Yes. That's... He seemed to struggle for words. That's completely irrational. Let me in, Abby. We need to talk like adults. We tried that last night, I said calmly. It didn't go well. You can speak with my attorney now. Frank's face flushed. I'm your husband. I'm not going to communicate with you through attorneys like we're strangers. We are strangers, I said, the truth of it settling over me. Or at least you're a stranger to me. I'm not sure I ever really knew you. He switched tactics, his expression softening. Abby, I know I made a mistake with the house. I should have discussed it with you first. But that's no reason to throw away our marriage. Let me in and we can work this out. I hesitated, aware of the years of conditioning that made me want to soothe his distress, to be the reasonable, accommodating wife. Then I remembered his grip on my wrist at the restaurant, the ease with which he'd forged my signature, the calculated betrayal of selling our home. No, I said firmly. I've made my decision. Any communication from now on needs to go through Arnold Davis. I handed him Arnold's business card through the gap in the door. Frank stared at the card, then crumpled it in his fist. This isn't like you, Abby. You don't make decisions like this. Someone's been influencing you. It was the same accusation he'd made at the restaurant, that I couldn't possibly have formed these opinions on my own, that some external force must be controlling me. It was perhaps the clearest illustration of how little he respected my autonomy. Goodbye. Frank, I said, beginning to close the door. Wait! His hand shot out, pushing against the door. What about my things? I need clothes, my laptop, my files. I had anticipated this. Jessica and I packed some essentials for you. They're in a suitcase in the garage. I'll text you the new garage code. His jaw tightened. You went through my things? Only to pack what you'd need immediately. The rest can be sorted out through the attorneys. This is ridiculous. You can't lock me out of my own house. Actually, I can, I said, my voice steady. Given your demonstrated willingness to sell this house without my consent and forge my signature on legal documents, I have clear grounds for an emergency restraining order keeping you away from the property. I haven't filed for one yet, but I will if necessary. Frank's expression shifted from incredulity to cold anger. You've thought of everything, haven't you? The meek little wife suddenly turned calculating. I was never meek, I replied. I was trusting. There's a difference. You won't get away with this, he said, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. That money is already transferred. The house sale will go through. You think your little provision will stop me? I have connections, Abby. I have resources you can't imagine. I felt a chill at his words, but kept my expression neutral. Are you threatening me, Frank? Because that would be unwise, given the legal scrutiny you're already under for fraud. His face contorted briefly before he regained control. I'm simply stating facts. The Seattle position starts in 3 weeks. The sale will proceed one way or another. We'll see about that, I said, and closed the door, sliding the deadbolt into place with a satisfying click. Through the peephole, I watched Frank stand motionless for several seconds, his body rigid, with fury. Then he turned and stalked to his car, slamming the door as he got in. I released a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, my hands shaking slightly from the confrontation. I texted Jessica, who was on standby nearby. He's gone. Didn't go well. Her reply came instantly. Coming over. Stay inside. While I waited, for Jessica, I called Arnold to update him on Frank's veiled threats. I'm not surprised, Arnold said when I described the confrontation. Men like Frank often respond this way when they lose control of a situation. We should accelerate our timeline. I'd like to file for an emergency freezing order on all your joint accounts today, and formally notify the buyers of the house that the sale is contested. Do it, I agreed. Also, I need to understand what connections Frank might have that could affect the house situation. He seemed very confident he could override the legal provision somehow. It's likely just bluster, Arnold reassured me. The deed provision is very clear. But I'll look into his professional networks, see if there are any unusual relationships with judges or officials that might be concerning. After hanging up with Arnold, I walked slowly through the house, trying to process the enormity of what was happening. Just 4 days ago, I had been living my regular life, unaware that Frank was selling our home out from under me. Now I was changing locks, packing his belongings, and filing legal motions to freeze our assets. Jessica arrived 20 minutes later, bringing coffee and a resilient spirit that lifted my own. Tell me everything, she said, settling at the kitchen. Island. I recounted my confrontation with Frank, including his veiled threats and confidence about the Seattle move. He's bluffing, Jessica said firmly, but her eyes revealed concern. Men like Frank always think they can intimidate their way out of consequences. Maybe, I agreed, but he seemed so certain about the money being beyond reach. I can't help wondering if there's something we're missing. We spent the morning making calls, to Arnold, to our bank to verify the freeze on joint accounts, to a security company Sheila had recommended to install cameras around the property. By noon, I felt marginally safer, but the weight of Frank's threats lingered. I need to understand what he's done with that money, I said, pacing the kitchen. If it's already moved offshore or converted to something untraceable, Arnold will find it, Jessica reassured me. That's what forensic accountants are for. But Frank's financial expertise gnawed at me. He worked with high-net-worth clients, helping them structure investments and sometimes minimize tax exposure through complex financial arrangements. If anyone knew how to hide money effectively, it would be Frank. My phone rang. a number I didn't recognize. I hesitated, then answered. "Mrs. Winters?" a woman's voice asked. "This is Meredith Kaplan from First National Bank. I'm trying to reach you regarding some unusual activity on your joint investment account with Frank Winters." My heart raced. What kind of unusual activity? There was an attempt to liquidate the entire portfolio this morning and transfer the funds to an account in the Cayman Islands. Our fraud detection system flagged it because it deviated from your normal patterns. I've been trying to reach Mr. Winters as the primary account holder, but his phone goes straight to voicemail. I gripped the counter for support. That transaction was not authorized by me. In fact, I need that account frozen immediately. My attorney has filed paperwork to that effect. "We haven't received any legal documents yet," Meredith said, sounding concerned. "But given the circumstances, I've placed a temporary hold on the account pending verification. You should have your attorney contact us directly as soon as possible." After thanking her and hanging up, I stared at Jessica in shock. He tried to empty our investment account, everything we've saved for 12 years. If their system hadn't flagged it, Jessica's expression hardened. This is financial abuse. "Abby, clear and deliberate. He's not just trying to take the house proceeds. He's trying to leave you with nothing." The reality of what Frank was attempting hit me with full force. This wasn't just about the house or the Seattle job. He was systematically attempting to strip me of resources, probably assuming I'd be forced to accept whatever terms he offered once I was financially desperate. But what he didn't account for was my separate account, the financial cushion I'd built through my hobby business. It wasn't enough to support me indefinitely, but it was enough to fight back, enough to hire Arnold, to pay for security measures, to survive while we untangled the legal mess Frank had created. I called Arnold immediately, updating him on the attempted transfer. He promised to expedite the asset freezing orders and suggested I consider filing a formal criminal complaint about the forgery and attempted financial fraud. "This is escalating quickly," he warned. "Frank is showing a clear pattern of deceptive financial behavior. We need to act decisively before he finds another avenue to remove assets." As I hung up, I felt a strange sense of validation. For years, small financial irregularities had made me uneasy. Unexplained cash withdrawals, investment decisions made without my input, accounts I wasn't given access to. Each time I'd questioned these things, Frank had dismissed my concerns, made me feel financially naive or unnecessarily anxious. Now, with the attempted transfer of our life savings to an offshore account, the pattern was undeniable. I hadn't been paranoid, I'd been perceptive. The separate account I'd established hadn't been an overreaction. It had been a necessary precaution. "He really thought I'd just collapse without resources," I said to Jessica, the reality of it sinking in. That I'd have no choice but to follow him to Seattle, start over in a place where I'd be completely dependent on him. "But you outwitted him," Jessica said, squeezing my hand. "You prepared, even when you weren't consciously planning for this. You trusted your instincts." As the afternoon wore on, I moved between moments of cold clarity and waves of grief for the marriage I thought I'd had. But beneath the turbulent emotions was a growing sense of my own capacity, not just to survive this crisis, but to emerge from it stronger and more truly myself. Frank had underestimated me in the most fundamental way possible. He'd mistaken my accommodation for weakness, my patience for passivity, my hope for naivety. But in doing so, he'd inadvertently forced me to recognize my own strength, a strength I would now use to protect myself from the very man who had promised to cherish me. By evening, Arnold had secured emergency orders freezing all our joint. Accounts and formal notification had been sent to the real estate agency and the house buyers that the sale was legally contested. The first concrete steps toward disentangling my life from Frank's had been taken. As I prepared for bed that night, in a house that still felt like mine despite Frank's attempt to sell it from under me, I realized that the confrontation at the door that morning had been a turning point. I had looked my husband in the eye and refused to yield to his manipulation, his anger, or his threats. I had stood my ground, literally and figuratively. Whatever came next, and I harbored no illusions that it would be easy, I would face it, on my own terms, with clear eyes and the growing certainty that I was, at long last, reclaiming my power. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing repeatedly. A series of emails from our joint credit card company showed unusual activity. A $10,000 cash advance taken at 2 a.m., followed by several large purchases at electronics stores. Frank was clearly trying to convert as many shared assets as possible into cash or goods before our accounts were completely frozen. I called Arnold immediately, my voice tight with urgency. "He's liquidating everything he can get his hands on," I said, forwarding the credit card alerts as we spoke. "The investment account is frozen, but he's finding other ways to access money." "I'll file additional emergency motions this morning," Arnold promised. "In the meantime, cancel every card you can and notify all financial institutions about the situation." The next 3 hours became a blur of phone calls and emails, contacting banks, credit card companies, and investment firms to lock down any accounts Frank might access. With each call, I discovered new financial tendrils I hadn't been aware of: a line of credit against our house that Frank had established 6 months ago, a brokerage account with a different firm than our primary investments, a safe deposit box I never knew existed. My home office became command central, with Jessica handling calls to some institutions while I managed others. Anna arrived mid-morning. With food none of us had time to eat and took over coordinating with the security company installing cameras. "This is like financial warfare," Jessica muttered as she hung up from yet another call. "Every time we think we've secured one front, another vulnerability appears." I nodded grimly, reviewing the growing spreadsheet of accounts and assets we'd discovered. Frank's been planning this for months, maybe longer. These alternate accounts, the line of credit, none of this was set up recently. The realization sent a chill through me. While I had been building my consulting business and tending to our home, Frank had been systematically creating financial escape routes, preparing for a future that didn't include me, at least not as an equal partner. By noon, Arnold called with both good and concerning news. "We've secured additional emergency orders freezing all identified accounts," he said. "And the real estate agency has formally acknowledged the invalidity of the sale due to the forged signature. They've notified the buyers, who are, understandably, upset but cooperating with the legal process." "That's something at least," I said, feeling a small measure of relief. "Yes, but there's a complication," Arnold continued. "The proceeds from the sale were never deposited into any of the accounts we've identified. According to the records we've obtained, Frank directed the funds to be wired to an LLC registered in Wyoming 3 weeks ago. We're working to trace it, but Wyoming LLCs are specifically designed for privacy. It may take time to establish the connection and freeze those assets." My stomach tightened. "How much time?" "Days, possibly weeks," Arnold admitted. "In the meantime, we should assume Frank has access to those funds. The good news is that we have clear evidence of fraud now, which strengthens our case for both the divorce proceedings and potential criminal charges." After hanging up, I shared the update with Jessica and Anna, who exchanged concerned glances. "We need to make sure you're protected, not just financially, but physically," Anna said firmly. "Frank knows he's losing control of the situation. Men, like him, can become dangerous when cornered." I wanted to dismiss her concern. Frank had never been physically violent, but the memory of his grip on my wrist at the restaurant and the cold fury in his eyes at our front door gave me pause. The Frank I was dealing with now wasn't the man I thought I'd married. He was someone willing to commit forgery and financial fraud without hesitation. "The security system will be fully operational by tonight," I said, "and Sheila's offered to stay here with me for the next few days." "Good," Jessica nodded. "And no direct contact with Frank. Everything through Arnold." As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a text from Frank. This scorched earth approach helps no one. Call off the lawyers and we can make a clean break. Otherwise, things get complicated for everyone. I showed the message to Jessica and Anna. Classic threat wrapped in reasonableness, Anna said, her expression hardening. Don't respond. I forwarded the message to Arnold instead, adding it to the growing file of evidence showing Frank's attempts to intimidate me. By late afternoon, I was emotionally and physically exhausted from the continuous crisis management. While Jessica continued making calls, I took a moment to step outside onto the back porch, breathing in the familiar scent of the garden I'd nurtured over years. The rose bushes needed pruning, the vegetable beds were ready for fall planting, and the Japanese maple's leaves were just beginning to hint at their autumn transformation. This space had been my refuge, a place where I could create and nurture life while feeling my own roots grow deeper. The thought of losing it to Frank's machinations sent a fresh wave of determination through me. This wasn't just about money or property. It was about preserving the life I'd built, the home I'd created, the future I deserved. When I returned, inside, Sheila had arrived with an overnight bag and a large folder of legal documents. I've been reviewing everything Arnold's filed, she said, spreading papers across the kitchen island. He's doing everything right, but we should be prepared for Frank to get creative. Men in his position often have resources and relationships we don't know about. What kind of relationships? I asked, remembering Frank's confident assertion about his connections. Professional networks, golf buddies, fraternity brothers, the old boys club, Sheila explained. I saw it constantly during my prosecuting days. Someone knows someone who knows a judge or has influence with a bank executive. They call in favors, expedite processes that should take weeks, find loopholes in systems designed to prevent exactly what they're trying to do. Her words resonated with vague memories of dinner conversations and charity events over the years. Frank introducing me to various professionals whose names and titles blurred together, maintaining relationships I'd always assumed were merely social or business-related. Now I wondered how many of those connections had been cultivated specifically for their potential usefulness in situations like this. How do we counter that? Jessica asked, joining us at the island. Documentation and publicity, Sheila said decisively. Backroom deals thrive in shadows. The more thoroughly we document everything and the more people who know about what's happening, the harder it is for Frank to leverage quiet influence. I nodded, understanding the strategy. That's why you suggested filing the criminal complaint. About the forgery, isn't it? Not just for legal purposes, but to create a public record. Exactly, Sheila confirmed. It's much harder for Frank to get special treatment when there's an official fraud investigation with his name attached to it. As evening approached, Anna left to pick up her children, and Jessica prepared to head out for a few hours to check on her apartment and grab fresh clothes. The security technicians finished installing the last cameras, demonstrating the smartphone, app that would allow me to monitor all entrances from anywhere. I've added Sheila and Jessica as authorized users, the lead technician explained. They'll get alerts if any motion is detected after the system is armed. When everyone but Sheila had gone, the house fell into an unusual quiet. I moved through the rooms, checking locks and windows, feeling like a stranger in my own home. Everything looked the same. The furniture Frank and I had chosen together, the photos on the walls, the books on shelves. Yet everything had changed. It's normal to feel disoriented, Sheila said, watching me from the hallway. Your whole reality has shifted in less than a week. I nodded, unable to find words for the swirl of emotions. Grief for the marriage I thought I had, anger at Frank's, betrayal, fear about the uncertainty ahead, but also, surprisingly, a growing sense of clarity and purpose. What gets me, I said finally, is that he must have been planning this for months while living with me, sleeping beside me, having normal conversations about grocery lists and weekend plans. How do you compartmentalize like that? Sheila's expression softened with understanding. That's what makes financial abuse so insidious. It happens alongside ordinary life, often invisible until it reaches a crisis point. As I prepared for bed that night, in a room that still held Frank's presence in the form of his remaining clothes and personal items, I realized that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new discoveries, and likely new attempts by Frank to regain control. But for the first time since discovering the house sale, I felt truly prepared, not just reactively responding to Frank's moves, but strategically positioning myself to protect what mattered most. With each financial account secured, each legal motion filed, each support person engaged, I was building not just a defense but a foundation for whatever came next. Frank had vastly underestimated what I was capable of. His biggest mistake wasn't selling the house, it was assuming I would collapse without him, that I lacked the resources, both internal and external, to stand my ground. He was about to learn just how wrong he had been. Morning arrived with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. While Sheila slept in the guest room, I sat at my kitchen table with fresh coffee, reviewing the detailed action plan Arnold and I had developed the previous day. Today wouldn't be about reacting to Frank's maneuvers. It would be about taking decisive steps to secure my future. The first item on my agenda was a meeting with Detective Lydia Torres at the police department to formally file criminal charges regarding the forgery. Arnold had emphasized the importance of creating an official record of Frank's actions, not just for the divorce proceedings, but as a foundation for recovering the house sale proceeds. "Ready for this?" Sheila asked, joining me with her own coffee. "As I'll ever be," I replied, gathering the documents I'd prepared. Copies of the forged signatures, the property deed with its dual signature provision, and the emails from the real estate agent confirming Frank had represented himself as having authority to sell. The police station was busier than I expected for a weekday morning. Detective Torres met us in a small interview room, her demeanor professional but compassionate. "Mrs. Winters, I've reviewed the preliminary report your attorney sent over," she said, opening a folder. "I understand you're alleging that your husband forged your signature on property sale documents." "Yes," I confirmed, pushing the paperwork across the table. "These are the documents in question, along with samples of my actual signature for comparison." Detective Torres examined them carefully. "The forgery is quite good," she observed. "Not an amateur attempt." "Frank has practiced my signature before," I said, remembering the times he'd signed birthday cards or permission slips when I was too busy. What had seemed helpful then took on a sinister cast now. "But he never used it for legal documents until this." For the next hour, I answered questions about our marriage, our finances, and the events of the past week. With each response, I felt a strange dual sensation, the pain of articulating Frank's betrayal publicly, but also the power of naming the manipulation I'd experienced. "Based on the evidence you've provided in Mr. Davis's preliminary filing, we have sufficient grounds to open a formal investigation," Detective Torres concluded. "Forgery of this nature is a serious offense, Mrs. Winters. Your husband could be facing felony charges." Though I'd known this intellectually, hearing it stated so plainly made my stomach tighten. 12 years of marriage, ending not just in divorce, but in criminal prosecution. "I understand," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I need to protect myself and recover what's rightfully mine." Outside the police station, Sheila squeezed my arm supportively. "You did well in there. How are you feeling?" "Like I've crossed a Rubicon," I admitted. "There's no going back now." "There never was," she replied gently. "Frank crossed that river when he forged your signature." My phone buzzed with a text from Arnold. "Meeting with the real estate agency's legal team confirmed. They're cooperating, fully with voiding the sale. Also, forensic accountant has traced the LLC. Call when you can." At Arnold's office an hour later, I met Patrick Donovan, the forensic accountant specializing in high-asset divorces and financial fraud. With his rumpled suit and unassuming manner, he seemed an unlikely adversary for someone like Frank, but his expertise quickly became apparent. "Your husband created a layered structure designed to obscure the money trail," he explained, showing me a diagram of interconnected entities. "The funds from the house sale went to a Wyoming LLC, which then transferred them to a Nevada corporation, which appears to have connections to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands." My heart sank. "Can we recover it?" "Absolutely," Patrick said with surprising confidence. "This isn't my first rodeo with this type of structure. It looks complicated, but it's actually fairly standard. The criminal complaint you filed this morning gives us additional leverage. Financial institutions in the Caymans don't want to be associated with criminal proceedings." Arnold nodded in agreement. "We've already filed emergency motions to freeze the assets of both the Wyoming and Nevada entities. With the police report officially filed, we can expedite the process." For the first time since discovering the house sale, I felt a genuine sense of hope. The mechanisms of justice, slow and imperfect though they might be, were being engaged on my behalf. "What about Frank?" I asked. "Have you heard from him or his attorney?" Arnold's expression tightened slightly. "He retained counsel yesterday. Martin Blackwell from Hargrove and Associates. They're known for aggressive representation in high-asset divorces." The name was vaguely familiar. Frank had mentioned Blackwell in passing once or twice, perhaps at firm events. Another connection he'd cultivated over the years. What should I expect? "Likely a two-pronged approach," Arnold said frankly. "They'll try to intimidate you into a quick settlement while simultaneously working to hide or protect as many assets as possible." Blackwell called this morning suggesting an amicable resolution that would involve you dropping the criminal charges in exchange for a generous settlement. I felt a flare of anger. "Absolutely not." "That was my response as well," Arnold assured me. "But be prepared for more aggressive tactics. With the criminal investigation advancing, Frank is facing not just financial consequences, but potential legal ones." As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. I answered cautiously. "Abigail Winters?" A smooth, professional voice inquired. "This is Martin Blackwell, representing your husband in this unfortunate matter. I was hoping we might discuss a resolution that would benefit everyone involved." I glanced at Arnold, who immediately gestured for me to put the call on speaker. "Mr. Blackwell," I replied evenly. "I'm currently with my attorney, Arnold Davis. I'll put you on speaker." "Ah, Arnold." Blackwell's tone shifted slightly. "I've been trying to reach you all morning. Any communication regarding Mrs. Winters should come through my office," Arnold said firmly. "As I mentioned in my response to your earlier overture, my client is not interested in dropping criminal charges in exchange for a settlement. Perhaps Mrs. Winters would like to hear the details before making such a definitive decision," Blackwell suggested smoothly. "Frank is prepared to be quite generous, despite the unfortunate misunderstanding about the property sale." Misunderstanding? I couldn't stop myself from interjecting. "He forged my signature and tried to sell our home without my knowledge." "There are always two sides to every story," Blackwell countered. "Frank maintains that you had discussed the Seattle relocation multiple times and had verbally agreed to the sale. He simply moved forward with what he believed was a mutual decision." The audacity of the lie momentarily stunned me. But then I remembered the countless times Frank had rewritten our history in similar ways, insisting I had agreed to things we'd never discussed, describing conversations that had never happened. "That's completely false," I said firmly. "And I have documentation proving the sale required my signature, which he forged. The criminal investigation will proceed, Mr. Blackwell." There was a momentary silence before Blackwell's tone hardened slightly. "I'd advise you to consider the implications carefully, Mrs. Winters. Legal proceedings become public record. Frank holds a position of considerable trust in the financial community. Allegations of this nature, even unfounded ones, could have devastating professional consequences. "Are you threatening my client?" Arnold asked sharply. "Not at all," Blackwell backpedaled smoothly. "Simply ensuring she understands all facets of the situation. Contentious divorces rarely benefit either party, particularly when careers and reputations are at stake." After ending the call, I sat in stunned silence for a moment. He's actually trying to frame this as protecting Frank's reputation, as if I'm the one doing something wrong by reporting a crime. "It's a standard intimidation tactic," Patrick said, looking up from his financial analysis. "Make the victim feel responsible for the consequences the perpetrator faces." "Well, it won't work," I said, a new resolve hardening within me. "Frank chose his actions. He can face the consequences. What's our next step?" Arnold outlined our strategy for the coming days, continuing to trace and freeze assets, preparing formal divorce filings that would detail Frank's financial misconduct, and coordinating with Detective Torres as the forgery investigation advanced. By late afternoon, when I finally returned home with Sheila, I felt both exhausted and empowered. I had spent the day not hiding or reacting, but actively pursuing justice. I had named Frank's actions for what they were, not misunderstandings, but deliberate deceptions and crimes. As I checked the security camera feeds on my phone and settled at the kitchen island with the tea Sheila had prepared, I realized something fundamental had shifted within me. The fear and shock that had initially paralyzed me had transformed into a focused determination. Frank had underestimated not just my financial preparation, but my capacity to fight back when pushed too far. "You know," Sheila observed sitting across from me, "in all my years as a prosecutor, the most satisfying cases weren't just about punishing wrongdoing. They were about helping victims reclaim their power. I'm watching you do that in real time." I smiled tiredly. "It doesn't always feel like power. Sometimes it just feels like survival." "That's where it starts," she said wisely. "The power comes later, when you realize survival itself was an act of defiance." Looking around my kitchen, the space Frank had tried to take from me, the home he had attempted to sell out from under me, I felt the truth of her words. Every legal filing, every frozen account, every documented lie was a step toward reclaiming not just my property, but my autonomy. Frank had pushed me into a corner, assuming I would have no choice but to follow him to Seattle, to conform once again to his vision of our life. Instead, he had inadvertently pushed me toward freedom. The following days unfolded in a strange rhythm of legal procedures and unexpected confrontations. I'd managed to freeze most of our joint assets and establish clear documentation of Frank's forgery, but he wasn't surrendering easily. My first indication came when Patrick called with troubling news. "Frank took out a loan against his 401k 3 weeks ago," he reported. "Nearly $200,000 transferred to an account we haven't identified yet." The timing suggested Frank had been planning his exit strategy for longer than I'd realized. The house sale wasn't an impulsive decision. It was part of a calculated financial extraction. 2 days after filing the criminal complaint, I arrived home from a meeting with Arnold to find Frank's mother, Eleanor, waiting on my porch. Her Mercedes was parked in the driveway, its sleek presence as intimidating as its owner. "Abigail," she greeted me coolly as I approached. "We need to talk." Eleanor had never approved of me. In her eyes, I was never quite sophisticated enough for her son, never quite deserving of the Winters family name. Now she stood on my porch like an emissary from Frank's world, elegant in her tailored suit despite the afternoon heat. "I think any discussions should happen through our attorneys," I said, stopping at the bottom of the steps. "This isn't legal, it's family," she replied dismissively. "You're destroying everything Frank has built with these ridiculous accusations. Forgery? Criminal charges? Have you lost your mind?" I felt the familiar pressure to apologize, to placate, to justify myself. Habits developed over years of dealing with Eleanor's subtle disapproval. But something had shifted in me. Frank sold our house without my knowledge or consent, I said calmly. He forged my signature on legal documents. He attempted to empty our investment accounts. Those are facts, not accusations. Eleanor waved, her hand as if brushing away an irritating insect. You've always been so literal, Abigail. Frank was trying to secure your future together. This Seattle position is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. A future he never discussed with me, I pointed out. An opportunity that required destroying my business and community connections. Her expression hardened. The Winters family has connections you can't imagine. This vindictive campaign will only hurt you in the end. Be reasonable. Accept Frank's settlement offer and drop these absurd criminal charges. The threat was thinly veiled, but I recognized it for what it was. Another attempt to intimidate me into compliance. First Frank, then his attorney, now his mother, each trying a different approach to wear down my resolve. I think you should leave, I said quietly. Any further communication needs to go through Arnold Davis. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. You've changed, she said, as if detecting a suspicious odor. The Abigail I know would never behave this way. As she drove away, I realized she was right. I had changed, not in the past week, but gradually over months and years of reclaiming. Small pieces of myself. The Abigail that Frank and his family thought they knew had been a carefully constructed accommodation, not my authentic self. Her visit confirmed what I'd suspected. Frank was getting desperate, activating every resource and relationship to pressure me into surrender. But with each attempt, my determination only strengthened. The more they pushed, the more certain I became that I was fighting for something essential. Not just property or money, but my fundamental right to self-determination. 3 weeks after discovering Frank's betrayal, I sat in Arnold's office reviewing the settlement agreement his team had prepared. The document represented countless hours of forensic accounting, legal maneuvering, and strategic pressure, a comprehensive response to Frank's attempts to strip me of financial security. The criminal investigation was the tipping point, Arnold explained, tapping the agreement. Once the prosecutor formally charged Frank with forgery and fraud, Blackwell's tone changed dramatically. Patrick nodded in agreement. Financial institutions don't like criminal investigations. The Cayman Bank froze the accounts as soon as they received the formal notice, and Frank's professional reputation began taking serious hits. The terms before me reflected a complete reversal of Frank's initial position. The house sale had been officially voided, with the buyer's deposit returned and their legal fees covered. The money Frank had hidden through the layered LLCs was being repatriated under court supervision. Most importantly, I would retain full ownership of the house on Maple Avenue and receive a significant portion of our joint assets as compensation for Frank's financial misconduct. He's agreed to all of this? I asked, still somewhat disbelieving. He didn't have much choice, Arnold said. The evidence was overwhelming, and the professional consequences of fighting this battle publicly were becoming untenable. The investment firm placed him on administrative leave pending the outcome of the criminal case. Detective Torres had called the previous day to inform me that the prosecutor was moving forward with charges of forgery, fraud, and attempted financial exploitation. Frank was facing not just divorce, but possible criminal penalties including fines and probation. There's one more thing, Arnold said, sliding an additional document across the desk. Frank wants a confidentiality clause. He'll provide an additional settlement amount if you agree not to discuss the details of his actions publicly. I stared at the figure, substantial enough to secure my financial future for years to come. A few weeks ago, I might have grabbed it without hesitation, grateful for any resolution that let me move forward. Now, I pushed it back across the desk. No, I said firmly. I won't be silent about what happened. The settlement we've already negotiated is fair. I don't need to be paid for my silence. Arnold studied me for a moment, then nodded with what looked like respect. I'll inform Blackwell. As I signed the final settlement documents, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that the legal battle was concluding. Grief for the marriage I'd thought I had, but predominantly a profound sense of validation. The system had worked. Frank's attempts to manipulate, hide assets, and pressure me into submission had failed. Outside Arnold's office, the late autumn sunshine felt particularly bright. Jessica was waiting in her car as planned, ready to celebrate this milestone with me. "It's done," I told her as I slid into the passenger seat. "The house is officially mine. The settlement is signed." She squeezed my hand. "How does it feel?" I considered the question carefully. Like I've finally broken free of something I didn't even fully recognize was holding me back. As we drove toward Maple Avenue, my home, truly mine now, I thought about the journey of the past month. Frank's betrayal had forced me to confront not just his deception, but the ways I had diminished myself to maintain the relationship. Each step I'd taken to protect my interests had also been a step toward reclaiming my full self. When we arrived home, Sheila and Anna were waiting with champagne and takeout from my favorite restaurant. The house that had nearly been stolen from me was now filled with laughter and friendship, the support system Frank had tried so hard to minimize. "To Abigail," Sheila said, raising her glass, "who taught us all what real strength looks like." 6 months after the settlement, I stood on my back porch watching spring transform the garden. The roses were beginning to bud, and the vegetable beds I'd prepared weeks earlier showed the first green shoots breaking through rich soil. Like my garden, I too was in a season of growth, though the process hadn't always been gentle. The divorce was finalized 3 months ago, a straightforward process given the comprehensive settlement agreement. Frank had accepted a position with a smaller firm in Seattle, a step down from the prestigious directorship he'd been pursuing, but a fresh start away from the professional repercussions of the criminal charges. He'd ultimately received probation and a substantial fine, consequences that recognized the seriousness of his actions without destroying his future completely. I hadn't spoken to him since the day in court when the judgment was entered. He'd looked smaller somehow, the confident facade cracked to reveal something more vulnerable beneath. For a moment, our eyes had met across the courtroom, and I'd felt a flicker of the connection we once shared. Then it was gone, replaced by the clear-eyed understanding that some bridges cannot and should not be rebuilt. My consulting business had flourished in unexpected ways. The skills I'd developed while tracing Frank's financial maneuvers, the attention to detail, the ability to follow complex money trails, the understanding of how assets could be hidden or protected, had created a new specialty. I now worked with several attorneys, including Arnold, helping clients navigate financial aspects of divorce and asset protection. "The garden looks incredible," Jessica said, joining me on the porch with 2 glasses of iced tea. "Almost as good as its gardener." I smiled, accepting the compliment without the deflection that would have been automatic a year ago. "It's been therapeutic, creating something beautiful from what was nearly taken from me." "That could be the title of your memoir," she joked, but her eyes were serious. Inside, we could hear Sheila and Anna laughing as they prepared lunch. Our Sunday gatherings had become a tradition, a chosen family supporting each other through life's challenges and celebrations. Next week, we'd be helping Anna move into her new condo, another woman reclaiming her independence after years of putting herself last. "Do you still think about him?" Jessica asked quietly. "Less and less," I admitted. "Not with anger anymore. Just perspective. I can see now how gradually it happened, how I slowly surrendered pieces of myself to keep the peace, to maintain the marriage I thought I wanted. And now?" I gestured toward the house behind us, my home, filled with friends who valued me completely. Now I'm building a life where I never have to make myself smaller for someone else's comfort. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been nights when the emptiness of the house had overwhelmed me, when doubts crept in during quiet moments, when the enormity of starting over at 44 seemed impossible. But each challenge had reinforced what the crisis with Frank had taught me. I was far stronger than I'd believed. Later, as we sat around my dining table sharing a meal and stories, I looked at these women who had stood beside me through the darkest moments and felt a deep contentment. Frank had tried to take my security, my home, my financial stability. But in doing so, he had inadvertently given me something far more valuable: the opportunity to discover who I truly was when all the accommodations and compromises were stripped away. The woman who emerged from that discovery was someone I was proud to be, someone who stood her ground, who trusted her instincts, who valued her own needs and dreams as worthy of protection. Someone who would never again allow her boundaries to be eroded or her voice to be silenced. To new beginnings, I said, raising my glass to my friends, and to the strength we find when we have no choice but to be strong. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.